Hello and welcome once again to our YouTube series, City and Image. And this series of discussions involves me and Norman discussing a number of things in the run up to the US election. The US election is a kind of backdrop to the kind of talks we've been having, but it's a way of us consolidating some of the work we've done together, but kind of a mutual interest in general themes around scripted space, infrastructure space. In our last episode, we talked about the history of the future. And this week we have a new topic to talk about. And just as before, where I was able to just spring a topic or a kind of general theme on Norman to respond to, I will do the same this week. And I've been thinking a little bit about what we should talk about next, because this is episode 4, so we might be running into territory that takes us slightly outside of our normal kind of comfort zone. But I think there's still space for thinking about topics, general areas of inquiry that we know very well. And so the kind of topic that I want to talk about this evening, Norman, is this idea of parallel worlds. And the parallel worlds idea is something that has come through, I know, in your teaching, your classes, and some of your writing, but also we collaborated on a journal not so long ago called Parallel Urbanisms. And that was a kind of way of expanding this idea of parallel worlds into something more particular about the relationship, say, between London and Los Angeles. And through the journal, we explored different dialogues, different forms of communication, different kind of ways of thinking, kind of parallel city. And like I say, in that case, it was London and Los Angeles. And it seems a kind of appropriate example now, because we're really talking about those cities. We're talking in particular about Los Angeles and its relationship to images. But of course, this notion of a kind of image space is infinitely tied to a kind of fluid and virtual world that lends itself to the very definition of a parallel world. So Norman, maybe we could start by just hearing from you a little bit more about your interest in parallel worlds and how it sort of has kind of moved into your research and your writing.
It began first, actually. Well, it goes back because it's very obvious in the course of the '60s. From J.G. Ballard on one side and then Philip K. Dick on the other, there's a kind of science fiction where parallel worlds are occupied. It's different than these Lovecraft horror pieces or whatever. There really are two worlds that coexist, and you go from one to the other. The most obvious world is life and death. So, like a novel like Ubik, you don't know whether you're alive or dead. And it's not clear to me whether Philip K. Dick was even sure himself when he wrote these novels. He was so completely wired in drugs. So there's something that in the '60s and '70s where that becomes a theme, if you will, right? In science fiction and even culturally speaking, and in some of the other theories about the coming of the post-industrial and so on, all these terms that caught on in the '70s, reactionary former Trotskyists like Daniel Bell, right? But then became an advisor to Reagan and spent his whole life wondering if he was really a socialist anymore. And everyone was saying, "Don't wonder, you're not." These guys. Anyway, it's not to wonder, leave it out. But I was working on this project, The Imaginary 20th Century, and being very clear as we were developing the layers of it, and as we were moving forward after I'd done this project, Bleeding Through, an online project, and Margaret and I started talking about it, and it became quite obvious that there would be a parallel world model for the whole project. And then I started to co-teach classes because we thought it was cute have a co-taught class, parallel worlds. Is that cute? A little, almost like our conversations. So it evolved sort of innocently, but then it became clear that as people are telling me now who are working on this period of media things I did, that I was developing a system of layers, right? A layered model. And I even had people build special maps for cities that were layered. And I became interested in the layered systems of Joachim Sauter and other people from Berlin in the 90s who developed special software that allowed you to work with layers. And it became clear what layers mean. I mean, I would say as a joke, well, if the world is no longer deep, it's definitely shallow and wide, and maybe that's a good thing. but if power is becoming more horizontal, right, then obviously our stories are going to be more like that. Or is it that our consciousness, our experience is becoming more and more split off, even in the 60s and 70s and 80s? And most of this was being done in the 90s, in the early 2000s. But it turns out I've been writing around it, but it was particularly true around the early 2000s and had a lot to do with the coming of the digital capitalist model. And people became clear that in their minds, if you talk about platforms, what's a platform? It's like this, right? And what's the other? And if you talk about the platform, where are you? Are you on? If there is a platform, you must be in there as a platform. So the whole logic of this parallelism became evident. And now that I've researched it more carefully, I understand what happened. That because of the consumer-driven economy, because of the collapse of Western imperialist hegemonic systems, we became very a-centered. And there are different ways of looking at it. Like if you look at an old Chinese painting, as opposed to, let's say, Japanese scroll, which is similar also, they're a-centered. And the Impressionists were very interested in that, in the independence, that the Chinese and Japanese were making a-centered paintings, and even movable scroll-like effects that influence cinema. So this has not happened never before, but it's really become very important now. It's very clear that we have a much more granular, a much more layered idea of power and of identity. And now with the shoebox existence on Zoom, parallel worlds have become almost comical. I mean, it's not even a metaphor now. It's not even a meme. It's not even a metonym. It's like how existence is. So we are now so parallel. So there is apparently a cycle from the late to mid 60s to the present in different ways where we have almost moved away from the canonical idea of the West and set up new kinds of histories. There's what they call world systems that were set up by geographers and other social scientists, theorists like.
I think,
you know what I mean? And we've all encountered it, and it's a big deal. And now the Chinese are doing their versions. You know that.
But let's just explore for a moment this change that's happened, because you talk about you talk about the 60s, and in the 1960s it was a kind of way of looking at the promise of the future. The parallel world was a way of extending our own horizons and a way of looking beyond our immediate surroundings.
Or the dystopic promise of the future.
To something that we recognize, but that was also outside of ourselves and our experiences. But more recently, that's changed. So the change from the 60s is really important, because the fact is that no one's really interested in this concept anymore, and I think that's partly because
parallel worlds.
I think it's partly because we all feel that we're in a parallel world. Parallel world becomes synonymous with a kind of idea of a flattening out and a sameness, a kind of the bad elements of globalization, but also the fact that when you look around different cities, different societies, there's a way in which everything is compressed into a familiar and like I say, generalized experience. I mean, just put simply, you know, like the whole idea around politics now. You look at the difference between, you know, Trump and say Boris Johnson in the UK. You know, actually, they seem to be going through exactly the same set of experiences, and they seem to be saying in different ways quite similar things. So, you know, the politics, but also the very notion of the huge corporations, Amazon, Google, Apple. You
They're
know,
almost like worlds unto themselves, aren't
there's a way that they forced parallel world into a world. So what would have been a parallel world is now just a single world.
but it's capitalism that operates in a parallel world way, and yet the smoke clears, and it's about profit. I mean,
it's about profit. Is profit driven sort of technology that I mean, this is all stuff we know. I mean, it's just, you know, the very idea that we have decisions made for us already. What we want and what we decide to do and what we decide to buy is or kind of designed ahead of us. So this parallel world is a world that kind of reduces everything down to, you know, increasingly a series of clicks. So the question now is not so much the 60s kind of utopian
that's early,
image.
by the way. I would prefer, cutting in quickly, it's the mid-70s where you really begin to see this happen.
But surely the challenge now is how we disentangle ourselves from a parallel world.
Yes, and do we mean it? Let's see how many parallels we have.
Yeah.
Pardon me, I'm coughing. I'm making a parallel sound. If you look at London versus LA for a moment, right? Both cities have this global sheen that no one can afford. That's now tremendously threatened by the new economy. It does look like the global pseudo cosmopolitan shine of London's not going to be the same. The same is true of LA, New York, and Hong Kong. Of course, it's tragic, so we have different versions. But still, what we created was a kind of like Nievel's novel, the city and the city, where two cities coexist, or like that science fiction novella from China called Folding Beijing, where you actually fold almost like an origami. The city of Beijing is folded out regularly. So that we understand how that worked. It was reinforced by inequality, by the incredibly endless supply chain of globalization. And now the supply chains are shrinking, but the inequality is still growing. And you just wonder what this all is going to look like. But no question that whatever the prototype of the parallel world city was, it's changing. It's going to change. And my guess is it'll break apart into hubs a lot more. I could see East London becoming almost a city bigger than London. I could see the same thing in every. So now we're going to see instead of going this way, we're going to see it go this way. But that's also parallel. Apparently, something happened to capitalism.
It's highly constructed. It's a constructed model.
Yeah, it's the end of manufacturing.
Entirely parallel.
I mean, we see the events that brought it on. Put it that way.
Yeah.
I think we could easily talk for 6 hours.
I mean, for our journal, when we decided on the article we were going to contribute for the parallel urbanisms, we decided on this title, Venice, didn't we?
Yes, it was fun.
And
remember how many we counted? We counted quite a few Venices.
We did, but the thing is that we went all the way back to 2007 when we walked around Venice Beach in Los Angeles. I think that was our first discussion about it, and you took me and Miguel around the various remnants of Venice, the kind of Albert Kinney's Venice. And we talked a little bit about James Bond and the various ways.
And that movie
it
also, the use of
backdrops and
drove your
real
car
Venice.
over the canal.
Yeah.
Right?
And then a few years later, well, some years later, I think it was like, when was it? It wasn't long
16,
ago.
like that.
2016. You came to London with Margot, and we went to visit Little Venice in West
Yes.
London. We were a little bit stuck because of the fact that there was very little relation between Little Venice and
Yeah,
Venice
it was a
Beach
name applied to it.
and Venice.
It had a canal, but they would have dray horses drag the boats through, and there was no Piazza San Marco in sight. Right?
No, there's nothing. And the parallel urbanisms turned out to be quite the opposite, in only in name, really, because they came from quite different histories. One kind of industrial, and then the kind of placemaking, and the kind of literary thing, and then the other in Los Angeles was an experiment in, I don't know, social education, or
yeah. I've been trying since the article to figure out why Venice, besides the fact that it's so beautiful, but it's not the only beautiful city on earth, right?
No.
And it became clear to me that one part of the story, just to summarize quickly, was that the birth of globalization was when the caravan trade from the east, which is where all the money was, went toward the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean was continued to have trade. Even the collapse of the Roman Empire didn't stop it. So the model for global trade and globalization is Venice. That Venice's existence at that time with the Arabs and the Venetians and the Byzantines in the Bosporus, that became apparently the model that was used by Portugal and by the mercantile Atlantic powers, like France and England. So actually, in some weird way, Venice is the city of trade, the imaginary city of trade, this phosphorescent thing. And then I realized that the law that they used to take a long, what was it called, a long journey or something. British people in particular would take a trip through Europe. They go up down the Rhine, they go here and there and so on. And it was in the 18th century, and they always wound up in Venice because they could have sex there more easily. And Venice had this phosphorescent image that the Romantics only enhanced. And then by you get to the Victorian age, Venice is like horny and historic, and Venice is like the first Britain. And so I kind of see how it happened.
But it's also got this dark side, hasn't it? Where
so it had this ironic double, which is true of all cities, like LA also. It has to have this noir twist to it. And somehow the Victorians really planted this idea. It became a symbol of Western trade, Western imperialism, and a kind of freewheeling Western culture. And also it was fun to copy it. But it becomes clear to me that there's a whole history of trade and parallel worlds of another kind, that if we stop thinking of ourselves as what happened to Europe, it actually isn't about Europe. It's about this eastern area of the Mediterranean into Central Asia that became the model for everything. And so, in a way, globalization brought that back, you see? There was a double triangular trade, apparently, in Asia and then in the Atlantic. And they had boats every few months that would leave from Acapulco, which is not the most famous place on earth, to the Philippines, and the two worlds would meet. But they didn't have enough slaves yet in the West Indies. 1.5 million people from India were shipped over as indentured labor. So it becomes clear to me that we were accidentally, right, sniffing something, right, similar to what other people had, that there is something about Venice that's neither east nor west, really,
No,
It's the model of a world,
it's a model. It's a model or image of infrastructure space, isn't it?
That's right.
And
And a city of
we
trade and a
and
city of pleasure.
then kind of appearing as a space of kind of leisure and entertainment.
Yeah. And also a ruin, because it's always about to fall apart.
It is this weird collapsing of these various categories of any city.
Yeah. So Venice can easily become a parallel. In fact, I had a friend who lived in Venice, and he said, I'd like to go to the Venetian in Vegas. I said, why is that? He said, well, there aren't as many tourists.
Yeah. And also you don't have to worry about the weather.
Yeah.
Or the time.
Yeah. Because, so there's a timelessness. So I get what happened.
It's always kind of twilight, isn't it?
But the remaking of Venice as a parallel world rather than as a kind of microscopic version of Western imperialism, which is, I guess, sort of the idea that they had.
But it's also an idea of familiarity, isn't it? That we recognize something of this infrastructure space, this space of entertainment, discovery, but also kind of risk. You know, there's this sense of Venice being a space of experimentation, where you can take on, just like in the carnival, you know, where you can wear a mask and you become another character. And we were talking about this in other discussions, haven't we? Absolutely. About how Zoom does something similar, or will allow for something similar, in the ease that you could move from appearance to appearance and take on different roles. And is that not the lure of Venice, that it is a kind of stage set for a theatricality?
And then it's also the archaeological birth of the Renaissance. All the Renaissance cities were modeled between Venice and Genoa, right? Even the inland ones.
But can you think of a more successful example of a city that combines infrastructure, trade, entertainment, leisure, and also this sort of dark and murky, sort of sinister, noir, carnivalesque, all together?
This is what they call a parallel pass. Obviously cities are now becoming that, and globalization made that of cities, and LA became one of the models of that because of the entertainment industry, because of, part of what this story is, I discovered, was the death of manufacturing. It never occurred to me that when manufacturing was like this, right? Everything you think of as manufacturing, it's not really an assembly line. It's smokestacks and the generative force of things and the way things move. But obviously, a more service-oriented economy is not like that, you know. And it's more about distribution. Once you're dealing with distribution, we're back to the Venice business again, and it's a vast change. And many cities have become like city-states. They become almost like Venice was. So,
but some cities are locked in; they're landlocked, aren't they? So they become less cosmopolitan, less interesting. They don't have the kind of flux of people, kind of backgrounds, heritages, these cultures that really add texture to a space. And Venice is that space of kind of influx of.
Well, let me throw a question back to you. Which city that has this cosmopolitan, so-called postmodern, which is now an old retro term, right? But what city that's not by the water is a great cosmopolitan city?
Let's have a think about it. I mean, I suppose London.
London is by the water.
Well, it's not really. London's landlocked. I mean, okay, it's got a river, but it's not a port as such. I mean, Paris, Berlin.
But Paris was left out of the. Now Berlin is an interesting story.
I mean, that's totally landlocked.
I think Berlin is the alternative model, but a lot of people say the problem with Berlin, it never has any money. So to us, we love.
But that's why that's part of the secret of its success, is that
It never globalized.
Because you know, it's impossible to kind of fully gentrify. Therefore, culture remains kind of lively and vibrant. But anyway, okay, that's a good question. You know, this relationship to the sea, because we talked about that in the article, didn't
And the
we?
sea being a symbol of course, of container ships and of tax havens. And
then
real
this is
estate
the
becomes
thing.
unbelievably expensive.
I mean, but this is the thing about Los Angeles, but Los Angeles doesn't have that relationship to the sea, which is interesting.
The two ports in Los Angeles represent 40% of everything that comes into the United States.
Yeah, but it's not built into the experience of Los Angeles.
The story goes back like this.
Yeah.
And that San Francisco interests purchased land in Santa Monica, which is where the port would normally be. The LA leaders, the boosters as they tended to call them, hated San Francisco to the point where they went to war against it in the federal government and found this patch of nothing, this ditch 20 miles away, and they dredged a harbor just so it wouldn't be San Francisco. So the LA harbor is 20 miles away from the city. So when you're in LA, you feel like you're
when you fly in
the city, but the harbors have over 30, I think something over 30, they used to anyway, over 30 million containers a year, and they have special roads and trains going out up to 50, 70 miles, all the way to the Inland Empire, where the Amazon stations are and the other things are. They built this huge system because LA used to be about aerospace and manufacturing, much more, and it replaced it with the ships. However, the weird thing is that when you go down to where the harbor is, the towns that are there are frozen solid and have no energy whatsoever. So obviously all the money has been staying with these container companies. And so it's a very different sense of the sea, right, than almost any other.
I mean,
this is a huge seafaring city that's inland almost in a way.
I mean, you're right, and you know, London obviously has got a strong relationship with the sea. There's the docks on the Thames, and it was a key space for, you know, trade, but maybe not in the same way that Bristol, Liverpool, Manchester, or those other ports cities that are really right on the coast were able to trade in I don't know. I mean, it's
very tricky to understand, but almost every major colossus, right, that's become a city state, they're almost all by the sea, and a lot of them are old Hansa.
Or like London have a very strong
maritime flavor
route into
its architecture feels like you're by the river.
It does. You're right, and the docks are obviously famous in these days.
It's complicated, of course, but it appears that we have a history that we never wanted to recognize because it's not simply Western. The history is along the littoral.
But what's striking about Los Angeles is when you go down to the seafront, you know, the image that you have or what you're met with is just beach.
Now, historically, that's right. It was only beach towns. They had only one trolley that would take them in. These are suburbs of the city. They never really were entirely the same as the inner city. Never.
No, it's interesting. Okay, just in terms of parallel worlds, I want to ask something, if that's all right.
Oh yeah, no, I hope I'm taking.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I just wanted to kind of shift a little bit to the idea of the parallel worlds being a way of talking about a connection with someone. So, you know, or a term of endearment that, you know, is often a phrase of that we use to express a kind of commonality of experience or backgrounds. But increasingly, that parallel world is also part of a kind of psychic condition that is not necessarily unconscious as such, but maybe something unsaid that we are, without knowing it, all part of a kind of parallel world, and we're kind of in agreement about that.
Well, if you look what's happened in Germany this week and the U.S. So it's not just the U.S. itself. These strange white supremacist explosions. There were 13 men who almost kidnapped the governor of Michigan and were going to murder her, and Trump feels that that's okay. He just said,
"Oh, that woman from Michigan."
Yeah, the governor.
Yeah. Well, that's how he refers to her, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and he basically said, "How dare you complain to us about what happened to you?"
Mm.
So there is a new parallel world issue politically that is splitting the United States to pieces, so that now Los Angeles and California increasingly identify themselves as a sovereign nation state. Even Arnold Schwarzenegger said that once as the governor. And the hope is that with this, if this election turns toward a more democratic model, the Democrats will begin to pull this together. But otherwise, we're going to literally have parallel worlds in the United States.
Yeah.
And the parallel that's really troubling, of course, is that 30% of Americans are not sure whether they want government at all.
Mm.
They not only don't want taxes, they don't want any form of government, even to keep them from dying of their own of a disease. Mm. So, and you got a hint of that in Germany last week, and it was like a carnival, but a carnival of weird people from another planet, practically. So now we have a parallel world politically.
But is it really a parallel world? Because in a way, that polarization would make you think, in fact, is counter to any idea of parallel world. The very idea is that they don't want.
Yeah, I see.
These two extremes don't want.
I'm trying too hard to make it fit the evening. That it really is more dialectical madness than two worlds floating side by side.
Yeah.
If anything, if the worlds did float side by side, they are now crashing into each other. The boats, the swimmers, as you being a swimmer, are swimming past their lane and crashing into each other. Right?
Yeah.
And so actually we've gone from a more parallel version to a much more dialectical and dangerous version, I suppose. But it's clear that, yes.
Yeah. I'm just thinking that, it's because the parallel, it's funny that this image, like we were talking about, of a parallel world, our understanding of it is often tied to a positive connection. You know, you have parallel cities that seem to be, is another word for friendship. You know, we live in parallel worlds. We're friends, we're buddies, you know? And there's this kind of idea that because there might be this kind of notion of similarity or connection, suddenly the parallelness becomes a bridge for friendship.
Yeah, that's interesting. So maybe it was at first a belief that this new economy and all that's going with it would work out.
Yeah.
You said at first that it was more an idea of progress, though Philip K. Dick, you couldn't tell, right?
Yeah.
And science fiction has always been dystopic, but in life, it's probably been part of the whole marketing of globalization that this is a nice thing.
It's a nice thing.
People, they have 50 times more money than you have, but they'll throw you a nickel, and they're not angry at you for your being by, and you shouldn't be angry at them because maybe one day you could join them. You know, it's a kind of belief in aristocracy as a form of mobility. Gee, look at them. See, if they weren't there, how would I know I had a chance? And anyone could stop and say, "Hello, this is not parallel. This is you're getting screwed." Well, right now, the screwed part is becoming more apparent.
But the thing about parallel worlds is that they become this idea of a kind of conviviality or commonality is the very problem that we're facing when we assume a connection. So this assumption of a connection, and this goes back to the kind of identity politics that is going on with in every institution, with a kind of an awakening or realization that in fact there is no commonality because we don't live in parallel worlds, we live in quite different worlds.
Yeah.
So the parallel world is, this bridge is actually part of the problem of a kind of false connection that enables a continuation of a kind of bad power systems that,
Yes, absolutely.
favor race, gender relations, and so on and so on. So the parallel world is something probably that needs to be questioned, but only
No big
because
question.
it is and challenged, only because it could be seen as something that's used to enable or continue these structures of power that, of course, are unequal and problematic.
Without a doubt.
But let's just go back to that earlier idea of parallel worlds that you started with in the 60s, and in fact, that's probably where we need to return to, because this idea of opening a parallel world that opens your horizon, not closes the horizon. So the idea of a parallel world becoming connected with an assumption of friendship or conviviality, a bridge that enables cities to recognize each other and people to be able to speak comfortably, is probably not the thing that we want. But in fact, the parallel world idea is actually more interesting when it becomes about extending outside of, say, your environment into something that enables a completely different awareness and condition. That you think of those sci-fi movies like Interstellar or something, and the whole sci-fi obsession with black holes, for example. It's always connected with a parallel world. So in Interstellar, they move around these different worlds, don't they? He kind of visits these various worlds, and they all look a bit like our own. There's one with a sea, but suddenly there's a huge wave that's going really slowly. So there's an idea of a parallel world that is also eerie and strange.
Absolutely. And now, if we think in science of culture from about 65 forward to 70, which is what you were asking about. So what are these parallel events? Number one, you have détente, and the Cold War becomes two parallel powers that don't hate each other but have to pretend to, and have this industrial military complex that just keeps going because they don't know what else to do. And then at the same time, you have a film like 2001, which of course is the first film that leads to Interstellar, and the Russians are there working side by side with the Americans in a parallel world that seems to come from the birth of the species and so forth, going back and forth. And all the software was developed to look at it. And so you begin to see all kinds of things. The economy set up during World War II that did so well, the Bretton Woods system was falling apart in the late 60s. And the Europeans hated it, and they demanded a change. The dates are beginning to coalesce, you see. And then it was finally clear to the Europeans, more than to the Americans, that the entire imperialist matrix that they had set up was falling to pieces, and they wanted to know what to do. And I suppose what the Europeans decided is, if we can't occupy them, can we still suck the life out of them financially? So they began to set up other ways through with the World Bank and so on. So NATO became almost like an industrial complex rather than just a war machine. All this happens within the same 5 years. And then by the early 70s, you begin to see the engine of it happening. So it seems almost peaceful and hopeful, right?
Mm.
That these new economies are going to happen and so on and so on. And it's better to have détente than something else. And there still seems to be a lot of money around. I remember as a young man being shocked at how much money was everywhere. I came from this slum in Brooklyn. I was smelling money everywhere I went. I wasn't getting any of it, but I knew it was there. But by the late 70s, it was gone. So we might say that it was almost the intuition of what became globalization and all the political, military, and cultural forces at play. The interest in entropy as a way of looking at culture.
Entropy, yeah.
And so all this is happening at once. There's too many coincidences for it to be a coincidence. So obviously, this was still the old post-war world doing reasonably well, right? Like the mods in London or whatever it's right? And the dystopia is being almost more theoretical than real, right? Mm. But by the 80s, we realized that this parallelism was a new economy and a new system of power that was unsustainable, right? And now we see how it is. So the vogue for parallel worlds, I guess, was a belief that it isn't that bad yet.
But what connection does
now we don't think parallel because everything is bumping into each other. It is that bad.
But the parallel world is also obviously useful for talking about specters and ghosts and the things that kind of haunt us. Is a useful metaphor for the unconscious. And you know, going back to 2001 Space Odyssey, it's all about kind of this dreamscape, the space of the unconscious sort of haunting the kind of key character in the film. And this recognition of oneself or yourself in a space that's out of joint, out of time, in a space that you don't recognize.
It's a strange version because, I mean, the psychiatric model that Freud pioneered was that basically if it didn't happen in your childhood with your family, it didn't matter. But the Lacanian model and the Castoriadis model and this and that, the models that caught on in the 60s were more that there was a schizophrenic relationship between the social image and your privacy. And the sense that it was being breached much more. And I would say parallel world is almost like an unconscious that actually manifests and like the famous.
But it's the same with Solaris as well, isn't it? You know, this very idea that sci-fi allows for an engagement with the unconscious and stands in for a kind of parallel world that we're kind of split between conscious.
But now apparently this new economy doesn't give us the isolation, the intimacy that the Freudian era did, right? Mm-hmm. Our unconscious is for sale. It's regularly being branded and marketed, and we like it. That's why we started to tattoo our skin. Mm. Is it because we're on display? Is it that we're trying to figure out where our skin ends? I mean, it's a very, very problematically ironic thing to do, I guess, given that it never happened before, not since the Druids or whatever it was. So there are all sorts of things, right? The plastic surgery thing I talk about so much. But I think that this new economy did not allow the psychic intimacy that we were used to. The old economy gave us a lot more privacy, right? And intimacy. This new economy is alienating in a new way. It invades us. It's parasitical. So, but in that interim period, it seemed like the parallel worlds were fun to play with until we discovered that it's not fun.
No.
You know, opiate addiction is not fun.
It's not fun because like we've been saying, it props up new forms of capitalism that end up acting against us. We're no longer kind of outside of, we are for sale, as you say, we become the products for sale. And these systems of power, such as, you know, these new technologies. I mean, this is why we're trying to get to the bottom of Zoom, isn't it? And in a way, what we're going through now is precisely an image of parallel worlds as they exist right now, right here in the present. And here we are brought together into a single space. You know,
and it's practical now. It's industrial, and it's an alternative for climate change. You don't make a carbon footprint. You just stare at each other, shoebox to shoebox.
Yeah.
And apparently there's a whole new sex industry. Someone was telling me about that's evolving very quickly.
I knew you'd get that in somewhere. Yeah.
Well, someone told me, said, "Oh, did you know about someone?" And they gave me these names, and I forgot to write them down. Right? Yeah. But it's so logical. Of course,
there's always going to be, if there's any scope for that, it will always happen, won't it? But
a lot of, in other words, these sex clubs are not making any money, so they'll give you a pole dance on Zoom.
Yeah.
So it's the sex clubs trying to find a way. They can't have takeout like the restaurants, so they do it this way. It's just, I mean, we're obviously, this has been the heartland of our crisis in part, is our loss of our own privacy, and now it's really, really going like crazy.
But do you feel through this new engagement with the digital, with Zoom, the way, for example, we have been talking over the last few weeks, have we kind of merged in a way that maybe has to be kind of thought out, obviously outside of a kind of physical geographies? Is there a sense in which the geography that we're in is completely now just joined up? So we may as well be living in next door to one another.
I know.
And talking over the fence. I mean, we're kind of talking over the fence, aren't we, in wherever. What's that actually mean? I mean, I know it sounds banal to say it like that, but it seems
I'm thinking about it a lot. First of all, because we both of us are teaching, and we're trying to see how the students are responding, and we're noticing to our shock that some of it actually works better in a weird way, but mostly it's strange.
But we have to move. I think we have to move in a different way, because what I'm noticing is that things have to happen quickly. I mean, you can't. There's no time for testing stuff or getting used to anything. You're just in it.
Yeah.
And we, you know, the more we're able to cope with that, you know, the more we can kind of move forward, more we can progress.
I suppose. But have we lost something? I often say that we live in a minus first act.
Yeah.
We're almost like when they have those DVDs of the movies and they have these special features, and the features would be more interesting than the movie.
Yeah.
So you pretend that you're in the catering line working in the production of the film or something.
Do you think
everything is getting ready to get started, and now we have nothing but getting ready to get started.
But how are people, you know, because there's going to be a point where people just will not want to look at this kind of screen. You know, why would you want to log on to anything like this for relaxation or entertainment? You know, so this is going to become.
I mean, but the arts and culture have an advantage that they want to play, because they're going to be savage. The brick and mortar sides of culture are going to be hit very hard in this new economy. So we know that we can. I mean, we're not experts, but we can smell it. You know?
Yeah.
The brick and mortar side of culture, from museums to galleries to movie theaters to theatrical performances of all sorts, right? And even the streets themselves might become less of a theater. We don't know to what degree, but we can tell that something is being siphoned off, right?
Well, it's been cleared out. It's been literally cleared out.
Yes. Yeah, so we know that there's a siphoning out, and we're thinking, well, why can't that also be culture? I suppose. I mean, I was just talking to someone yesterday, and he found money in Germany so that his new book, from a press that we know, right, is going to be online immediately.
Mm.
So the book will be online immediately because it's just too expensive to publish 500 copies in paperback anymore. And so they'll have hardback editions for $150 that only 3 libraries will buy, right? And then you'll just get the book immediately online. It'll be there. And so, and he said what you would say. He said, I do miss the book. I love the book. that's part of what brought me to this profession. But apparently my students are getting used to reading online, and even I'm getting used to it a little bit more. And I guess I have no choice. So the Zoom thing is kind of like that for us. You know, we realize that it's going to have to turn into something a little bit more because too much energy is moving over.
Do you think this speeding up? I mean, it's not really like an accelerationism. It's slightly it's a different thing, really. In the sense that this speeding up of work or ideas, the way that ideas emerge, not necessarily in a better form, but certainly more quickly, and become circulated immediately. Is this also to do with a kind of nervousness about us all kind of running out of time, in a sense?
Yeah,
the fact is that I think we all have a much greater sense of our own mortality for obvious reasons. And there is a sense in which there's a bit of a rush, you know, to get things out, to get things done. These new tools that we're working with right now, and so on, allow us to do that more easily.
Yes. Yeah, I understand. But you've mentioned this sense of morbidity. And of course, there's good reason to feel morbid, right? I mean, our politics...
more mortality, sense of mortality. Mortality, yeah. I mean, our own, you know, our own mortality becomes much more present in the face of climate crisis, in the face of the collapse of society, and kind of alienation from, you know, the communities around you, because you literally cannot be part of it. So the sense of your own fragility on every level is heightened, which increases this awareness of our own mortality in a way that maybe a more physical experience, where we're in physical space, we're interacting with people, might shield us from, you know, because it's a kind of distraction, isn't it?
I mean, when everyone's afraid of the atom bomb, I remember growing up with that, right? And they would even prepare me to get ready for the atom bomb. They said, if the atom bomb is coming, go in the doorway and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
And I looked
under
at
the table.
I looked at the other fourth graders, and I basically would say, in one way or another, he said, does this thing make any sense to you? And he said, shit, no. Are you kidding? You know, I've seen the pictures. I've seen the stuff, you know, the atomic testing things on TV, you know, but so there was something almost detached about our morbidity, because we're making a lot of money. The secret was that we were a lot richer than the Russians anyway, and so on. So it was a kind of a false memento mori. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But now the United States has a non-functional constitutional crisis, and a man who's mentally ill screaming, and people actually almost kidnapping a governor. And there are things happening in the U.S. that no one's even seen, even during the Civil War. I mean, so no one could say parallel my ass.
But it's not.
Morbidity is stronger.
In also relation to, you know, the kind of apocalyptic sort of climate crisis. You know, that, you know, it is a completely different situation to...
The sky in LA is still, I still can't see the mountains the way I ordinarily would. It's still there. I mean, you can still, it's not much, but it's there. And the sky cleared about 35 years ago. So we're back to 35 years ago. Of course, the fires will dissipate and so forth, but every place, Europe is experiencing this like crazy. The Mediterranean is being very hard by climate crisis.
We've had the hottest day on record in the world was recorded, wasn't it, in Death Valley this year?
130.
And so on. I mean, these kind of things are ridiculous. But just in relation to the parallel world kind of theme, I suppose, just to continue that for a moment, if we look at history, you know, we try and draw a parallel with history, but we're struggling now because there is no real parallel historical moment.
I'll tell you the one I went to in this book I'm doing on the present. I felt that 1895 was better than 1995, but then I wound up in 1630s. I found that I needed to go back in time to points where the the systems were in an interregnum that was as strange as ours, because we got deluded in the 90s. We thought it would work out. There was a false spring. I remember people telling me crazy things in the 90s. The internet, don't worry about it. It's too anarchic to make any money. I said, are you sure?
Yeah.
I mean, and on and on and on. Clinton's penis was a crisis. What, are you kidding? I mean, Trump's penis is practically the only athletic thing he has going for him, right? It goes on and on. I mean, we know every week we hear another thing that he apparently did, I guess when he was a little slimmer, you know, but it just, yes, it's been a real struggle. I'm going back to what we have basically is inequality and a kind of aristocratic privilege growing almost like a feudal condition that's attaching itself to capitalism. So capitalism likes feudalism. Rich people like to have serfs. Rich people like to have fancy castles. Rich people have always liked it. The feudal thing always looked good to them. They like the idea that labor had no collective bargaining possibilities. So it's easy to attach feudal things, but when you attach them, does that mean the old stuff, do you know what I mean? The old rules come back. It turns out in the US that's really true, that they really had feudal law for indenture in the 1600s that was used in Jim Crow days, same laws, and so on. And what in the Tudor period in England, they adjusted some of these laws so that they could crush labor more, and the guilds and so forth, and the enclosure stuff needed feudal law to destroy people way into the 1850s. Enclosure is a very big deal in the history of Great Britain, right? In the UK. So I guess we're sort of moving forward in a moving sideways forward. and we have this strange sort of fungus, like on our fingers and toes, right? And we don't know what it is, but it's actually something similar to a kind of feudal condition, not a system. And that condition hates government, hates this, hates that, and it has a very, very casual idea about the unconscious and privacy. And
but there's also a kind of delirium and excitement, isn't there, about this moment of crisis, that people are genuinely excited about the possibility of a kind of change, even in the face of terrible disaster.
I hope so. I'm trying to speak to that. Like, I'm trying to be whimsical about it. I'm trying to make
but
jokes.
You can't help, you know, it's like the addiction that everyone has to the news, because whatever you think of it, it is affecting us seemingly more directly than it ever has in our lifetimes. Certainly in my lifetime, it's not distant, it's right there. And we have this strange addiction to these continual updates, because there's a sort of excitement that goes with it. That, well, what's going to happen tomorrow? What announcement are they going to make that will affect us?
Yes, I agree entirely. I mean, I often say, let's make it clear so you understand. You know you're living in history when every day feels like a month. So tell me, are you living in history? And then the kind of paleness
on the tiles.
Yeah.
Paleness.
Fatigue,
tile fatigue. I mean, we really, if we were kind of better with technology, we could do some amazing things with Zoom, couldn't we? We could have always a whole load of kind of color coding going on, different ways of reflecting kind of internalized kind of thoughts, you know, like on screen, all these kind of things.
Or maybe we'll have to invent fictions about Zoom that deals with the alien. I mean, art, as you know, takes what it can't do and turns that into a feature. The fact that film is just a machine, the fact that painting doesn't really move. These became generative forces, right? And so maybe we could find out what Zoom doesn't do and make that important and invent narrative.
and how it can control a kind of social interaction. So you imagine with, you know, say with the classes that you have or any kind of meeting groups, that on these tiles you could have a little an alarm. You've had more airtime than other people in the class, or red light goes on. Time to speak. Time to speak now, because you haven't said anything yet. You know,
That goes to date. The
you know
rules
that,
by
there's this kind of social conditioning that could come through. You know, like, oh shit, I've got to say something because, you know, like I might be considered sort of you know, outside of the group if I don't play my part.
There's something sort of Protestant and Calvinist about the Zoom, right? That you're in the commonality, and you've got to affirm your connection to almost this religious thing that
like you don't have at all when you're with a group of people, because there's no, because you need more tools to understand the kind of clues that you get in a physical situation. Yeah. So when you have all the kind of body language, or the kind of just the sense you have from being around people that tells you, oh, this is okay and this isn't okay, you don't have that on this. So we may find that we need all sorts of like little indicators.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I was even thinking, would it be fun to have a movie on Zoom about people having a seance where spirits jump in while they're seancing? But I don't know. I have a feeling that what Zoom really is it does slow down vision a little bit. With Zoom, you can talk a little slower. So it's fast and slow.
You think? You know, okay, that's interesting.
But I'm hoping. See, I'm trying to look for something that's not completely negative, because it is too Zoom.
No, we're trying to make the most of it, aren't we?
That's I like what you're trying to do. Yeah. And I say trying to do because that's all that culture is.
I mean,
you always try to do.
We already know that everything we do is a kind of form of failing, you know. But
yeah, I'm happy with it.
That's okay. We just need to sort of test things out. Yeah. Talking of which, I need to go because I've got somebody who's come around for dinner, and you know, amazing, isn't it? They've actually dared to come around to the house.
Yeah, I know. Oh yeah, the whole. Anyway, this is a lot of fun, and it's opened up stuff that we could talk about for at least another 6 months, I think.
Yeah, were you happy with that?
Making it old term and making it new is interesting.
What? Were you happy with the topic that?
I think because it's old, and then suddenly you realize that why it's old, why it happened. The whole thing came and went, and we barely noticed it. And post-structural motifs don't seem to capture it.
No,
you know?
No, I think there's a lot. It's made me think a lot more about these terms. You're right. It seems nostalgic, old-fashioned, outmoded, parallel world. You know, but why?
But we never understood why.
Considering we're more connected to what you would imagine that means than ever before.
Yes.
We're not. It's not part of our vocabulary anymore, really.
Is it possible, with a degree of foreboding and irony, people sense what's coming, but they don't believe it?
I
so
think
Parallel Worlds was almost like a foreboding and irony of what could happen, and saying, "Oh no, it can't be that bad," and then it became pretty much that bad.
But there's also a secret, willful side of people that kind of we're in such a state of inertia that actually, you know, the terrible disappearance and crisis again is a kind of form of excitement. You know, it's the potential of kind of finally everything changing. All those things that it seems so impossible to change, that kind of come round and round again and again.
I can see within 2 or 3 years, issues that we've been fighting over for the last 25 years may just happen. It won't solve things, but it's going to be amazing in the United States if the election goes against Trump, which appears to be what's happening. He's also going through an actual nervous breakdown.
Well, I think they've got a secret body double.
Well,
Because I just want to finish with this
we
idea of the parallel worlds. I think there's a parallel Trump.
Well, I think Trump is already setting up a movie about himself,
Yeah,
and Boris Johnson's going to play the young Trump.
he'd be perfect for that. I sort of slightly
And
more
Boris said, "That's all
slightly
right. He trained me to
quieter.
be more of a." He said, "Oh,
Yeah,
British people are good with American
the
accents."
slightly more vulnerable version, but basically the same kind of thing. Yeah.
Anyway, you got to run, and there's so many, but this was a lot of fun because it opened up about 12 different questions we can't answer. But there is a historical thing. It happened over a period of 40 and 50 years,
Yeah.
and here we are. So parallel world may be old, but it never solved itself. It was never solved.
Our episodes, as we continue with these series of discussions, it's a bit like on the computer game. When you get to different levels, it's getting harder and harder.
Well, maybe
we started with the easy stuff, and now we're really getting into.
Maybe we should point out in each one the modernity of the moment. That this no one knows whether Trump is going to actually get COVID worse. No one knows, and maybe we should leave a hint in each one as to which part of the trajectory it happens. Because as we move closer and closer, and after, it might matter which week it is even.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. Anyway, this is a lot of fun. And yes, we're taking, let's put it this way, not since the early 1900s as a generation of young people had so much responsibility all at once. And let's hope that they don't wind up in the First World War. But I think that it could be the making of them. It's a majestic moment, even if it is terrifying. And it's also very, very, very funny. It's darkly funny. I'm sorry to say, as death is everywhere.
But we are of course fully aware that it's funny only because we're in an incredibly privileged position.
Yes.
It could very, very quickly become not funny at all.
No. I mean, it's not our industry. Our university industry is tremendously hard hit by all this. That's not funny. But I have a feeling 50, 100 years from now, there'll be comedies about this.
It's kind of funny to see these, in a very weird and perverse way. It's kind of funny to see these institutions suddenly grappling with their own identity and having to quickly backtrack on all the rules and regulations that were at one point apparently so important and suddenly have just been thrown into the air, just to survive. That's quite funny.
There's a Weberian parallel world that's happened, that the administration of many industries and our industry too has created this weave of people who don't know what's actually happening. They just sort of live in this neoliberal fantasy, a kind of non-profit neoliberalism. And now they're suddenly confronted with having to figure out what to do with a real crisis. And I think they're confused. That's respectfully, and I'm not trying to act superior. Respectfully, I think they're confused.
Yeah, I think you're right. But in a way, just before we get the whole relationship with education is becoming, in some respects, very interesting, because there are bigger questions being asked about, what is being delivered, how is it being delivered, and to what extent is it really engaging with the kind of challenges and key issues that we're facing.
I agree. The challenge is only once the election crisis, if it gets worse, it gets worse. But if the election crisis is not the one that will blow up the world, like in other words, the Trump business, then we have to confront what's been there all along. And university people are used to sitting with their arms folded, looking at the world, saying, "Oh, what a shame!" Right now, their arms are folded, and there's a little red dot on their forehead, and they realize that they're also, on the firing line. And this is a new place for university.
It's very unusual. It's a very unusual situation. I remember when I was at the British School at Rome, and there was this story about the student protests in the 60s, and afternoon tea, they'd normally meet in the kind of Lutyens quad. But on those days of riots, they locked the doors and decided to go up onto the upper balcony so they could view the fights in the street while drinking the tea. But you know, this of course can't happen anymore.
No, now I'm afraid we don't have a balcony.
There's no balcony, then there's no doors to lock.
Yeah. So this could be the making of our industry too. We may have to confront certain things. I mean, one has to hope that there is something about human nature that can rise to the occasion, however clumsy it is, however confusing it is, and that perhaps it's the making of us. I'd like to at least leave that 1% option.
Yeah. Okay. Well, see you soon, Norman.
Yes, you bet. Enjoy dinner. Bye.
Bye.